We are here to finally celebrate the completion of the World War I Memorial. So honored to be a part of the project. So excited to see it completed.
We're lighting for the very first time the 60-foot bronze called A Soldier's Journey.
This is the culmination of so many people that have worked so hard and didn't care about the credit and just made it happen because we knew it was the right thing to do, and to remember those who served in the past, remember those who are serving right now, and in 100 years to tell them their service will not be forgotten.
In building this memorial, the World War I Centennial Commission has renewed the vows of faithfulness between this country and those young men and women with a new sacred promise for all to see. It has been a privilege to witness the devotion with which the Commission has fulfilled their mission against the greatest of odds.
We actually had a press conference to announce the effort to try to create this memorial and why we were doing it. I remember a reporter coming up afterwards and basically saying something like, "Do you really think this is going to happen? I mean, you know, after all, it's been over 100 years and memories fade and people die. Do you really think this is possible?" And I remember looking at that reporter and I said, my father fought in that war. And I think we owe it to people like my father, who because of their sacrifice gave us the country we now have. You're damn right we can make this happen.
When my husband, Jack, was a little boy, he used to go out with his grandfather, and Jack was always just surprised at the number of people who would follow them down the street with cameras or just pieces of paper asking the general to please sign an autograph. No one remembers. Some of the older people I've met say, "General Pershing? That name sounds familiar." Or, "Oh, there's a Pershing Street in my town." But they have no idea. I'm so happy that we're going to get this built to recognize all of the people who nobody has paid any attention to. That was just such an altruistic group of people, and everybody went, and they all managed to get along, and they saved each other's lives, and they made it work. The general had every camera in the world on him, and so did some of his aides, like General Patton, MacArthur. These people, many of whom didn't even make it home, have had almost no recognition for what they did. And this war represented all of us in the States. I think the general would say it's about time.
World War I was a war that changed everything. It changed the social fabric. The community began to change across the world, the condition of the status of women, the condition and status for African Americans, for Native Americans, immigrant Americans. The configuration of the political map changed. 4 empires fell, and we had new countries created out of that war. All these things changed in that great war to fight and protect democracy.
World War I was possibly the most decisive, monumental change in history. industrial production was at its height. The lack of political animosity among the nations of the world was remarkable. And then it was destruction from the Urals to the English Channel.
The war had been going on for somewhat 3.5 years before we entered, and it wasn't going well. It was a virtual stalemate at that particular time. And the United States went in with about 18 months left in the war and turned it and basically won it. While we lost, so many thousands in doing that, in a way we saved many, many lives because we ended a war probably long before it actually was going to end.
In a matter of 18 months, we went from a tiny, almost non-existent U.S. Armed Forces to nearly 5 million in uniform, men and women. And of that, we deployed 2 million to combat in France. And during that short period of time, these practically untrained young GIs and Marines beat the preeminent military force on the face of the earth, which was the Kaiser's armies. What would have happened had the Americans not been willing to step forward and try and save civilization and humanity by fighting in Europe?
I came to the World War I Memorial Project in a kind of a roundabout way. The journey actually started here at the DC War Memorial. One day when I was out on a run, I stopped and I walked over to figure out what it was, and I learned about it. This is the District of Columbia's memorial to its residents who fought and died in World War I. You have this local World War I memorial right next to the national memorials to the 3 other great wars of the 20th century. And as I often say, my sense of symmetry was offended. And I thought, why isn't there a national memorial to World War I? And that was what I call my if not you, who moment. I said, all right, I'll kick this ball down the road and see where it goes.
Edwin was the real visionary for a national World War I memorial, but it hadn't happened in 100 years. It needed help, especially from the Congress, and Congressman Ted Poe was there for us.
When I served in Congress, I had the opportunity to meet the last surviving doughboy, Frank Buckles Jr. He was over 100 when I met him. And I learned that he served in World War I. He lied to get into the United States Army. He was 15 or 16. He told them he was 18. He drove an ambulance, rescued other doughboys who'd been wounded or killed on the battlefield. And he said, there needs to be a memorial here. And he asked me who I was, and I told him who I was, and he said, you get it done. Representative Cleaver was also wanting to get the World War I memorial built. So we got together and started talking about how we could get this done. Both of us came to the conclusion it was way overdue.
The judge and I hit it off, and we began to work together, and we were an unlikely pair because he was a conservative Republican and I was a liberal Democrat. But we actually became friends. And so I began to call him the judge, and he called me preacher.
The issue was not politics. The issue was what was right for America and the American doughboy. And politics never entered into it. Emanuel Cleaver is a tenacious guy. And when he made up his mind that it was going to get done, it got done.
It was not easy to get done. We had to get beyond personalities. We had to get beyond politics. It's a memory of what happens when people cooperate that I'd like to carry on for the rest of my life.
We need to put aside the pride of politics, as I call it. Most good legislation is bipartisan legislation. And this was a perfect example, this World War I commission. We both would testify at these committees, the subcommittees, the main committees, advocated on the House floor. I thought it would be a lot easier than it was. And then all of a sudden it all happened.
Dan Dayton called me in the summer of 2013 and said, Meredith, the World War I Centennial Commission is a thing. We're gonna build a memorial and I need your help. I need you to volunteer. And I said, Dan, absolutely, I wanna work with you. I'll be employee number one, but I live in Richmond and the commission's in Washington, DC. And he said, Meredith, we have no office space and no money, so I don't care where you work.
This commission was set up in law with a specific provision in it which says no federal funds may be used in the pursuit of accomplishing this legislation. To illustrate what that meant, at one point our commissioners who are spread out around the country were all coming to Washington for a meeting, and I said, why don't we have a meeting in the Pentagon? So I called up somebody and said, hey, can we get a conference room to have our meeting? He said, well, the use of a conference room is considered government expenditure. There's a cost associated with the conference room, and your legislation says you can't spend any government money, so you can't meet in the Pentagon.
The first meeting of the commission that I went to, they had a French representative there. He had a €1 billion budget that year to bring together the French people's remembrance of the sacrifices they made, which were enormous. And here we had a budget of 0 with some operating cash, and Dan Dayton borrowed National Guard sergeants and people from other agencies on loaned manpower.
We didn't have any money to do this, but we had our time and our grit and our dedication. I think it gave us all this sense of duty and obligation, and we were the underdog. Not dissimilar, I think, to where America was at the beginning of World War I. We had no, real army to speak of, except we had millions of Americans who felt it was their duty and obligation to sign up, to serve their country.
They were the first to go to another country that most had never visited, fight in a war they didn't start. Most importantly, were willing to die for peace and liberty for people they'd never met. Today, we have men and women stationed all over the world who are doing this. So you and I can make the choices that we take for granted every day as Americans who understand what peace and liberty is all about.
This memorial would not be built if it weren't for Terry Hamby. He didn't know much about World War I at the time, but he has a history of military service. Every member of his family going back to the Revolutionary War has served, including himself.
I just got a call from the Majority Leader's office, and they said, okay, your new commissioner is Terry Hamby, and he's from Kentucky, and here's his phone number. So I called him up.
Dan ran me through the rules, what I could do, what I couldn't do, talked about the pay, which was nothing. It was the perfect wage. And I started trying to learn and read as much as I could about the Great War. And after you read, you wonder, how did we miss it? How did we miss it?
People had forgotten about World War I, and it was huge and important conflict. I had the good fortune to know Terry Hamby, who I was aware had long history with the military. What we tried to do was to sort of re-educate the American people about the importance of that conflict. We had to have somebody leading the charge, and that was what Terry did so successfully.
He really rolled up his sleeves and got to work, not only on securing an appropriation from Congress for us, but really working with key leaders on Capitol Hill and in the administration to make sure this thing became a reality.
It was very difficult for us to get an appropriation from the Congress because there were no living veterans. And if there were no living veterans, there were no constituents in my district to whom I can report, gee, I'm going to, recommend we spend your tax dollars on a World War I memorial.
I knew going in we didn't have any resources from the federal government, so we were going to have to be very, very creative in how we approached this process. We didn't have a natural constituent base, not like a hospital with grateful patients or a school with alumni. So how do you tell the story that happened 100 years ago? How do you make it relevant to people?
We identified legacy companies, people that had an affiliation with World War I, and we started calling them and sending them letters. We sent CEO letters across far and wide, and we just got a bunch of no's.
I didn't know how to be a fundraiser. I had no idea. And one of the commissioners was appointed by President Obama was Dr. Libby O'Connell. And Libby O'Connell was at that time the chief historian at the History Channel. I said, Dr. O'Connell, my name is Dan Dayton. I'm the executive director of the commission. It's a pleasure to meet you. And she said, well, I'm going to give you $50,000. And I thought, this fundraising is pretty easy.
The thing that really worried me about the commission, and it did for years, was the lack of funding. I was not optimistic. I just thought, really, we don't have anybody on the commission who has super deep pockets.
World War I centennial chairman be authorized. A short discussion of...
We were very fortunate in recruiting some prominent national leaders like Secretary Leon Panetta, General Barry McCaffrey, Admiral Mike Mullen, to make calls, make introductions to their network, to make cold calls to people who weren't in their network, and say, this is important to us, this is important to the country, please hear these people.
When Dan Dayton called me, I did whatever he asked me to do. At the end of the day, this effort needed to depend on people to answer the phone and say, yeah, I'll give it a shot. I'll write the letter, I'll make the phone call, I'll make the visit, whatever is required.
I basically was brought into this by a friend of mine, General Barry McCaffrey, and he and I had been involved with the Vietnam Memorial, and I'm a Vietnam veteran. And even though it was over 100 years ago now, it is amazing to me how many families have responded, how many families had grandfathers or great-grandfathers who fought in World War I.
The sons and daughters of the doughboys were the World War II generation. And they had their memorial and the fundraising for the World War II memorial. My generation had the Vietnam memorial. World War I was sort of relegated to the mists of obscurity in terms of the U.S. national consciousness. I was initially surprised, in fact shocked, by some of the rejections that we got.
You get a 10,000 no's, and then every now and then you'll get a yes.
I called Ken Clark, who was the executive director at that time of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library in Chicago. And I just recall going to a meeting at 10 o'clock in the morning on Lakeshore Drive, and I walked 3 blocks, and I've never been that cold in my life. And I got in and got warm, and Ken gave me a cup of coffee, and I gave him our pitch, and I told him what we were trying to do. And about that time, Colonel Jennifer Pritzker walked in. She said, how much money do you need? And I said, well, about $50 million. And we went through the proposal, and she said, well, I'm not going to give you $50 million, but I might give you 5. And that's where we started this wonderful relationship with the Pritzker Military Museum and Library.
Prior to that, if it had not been for that sponsorship and the $5 million from the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, we would have been bankrupt.
Dan and I literally would get on a plane. If you were interested in hearing our story, we were constantly having to pivot, constantly thinking, okay, what are we missing? Is there a different angle?
Eventually, it all came together. The great idea of could we find connection and genealogy to the doughboys? And we recruited student interns to begin looking at draft cards and then military service records of the doughboys. And that was a treasure trove.
Everybody had to register for the draft in World War I. And when you've registered for the draft and you filled out your draft registration card, you did it in your own hand. So I pulled one up for a leading senator. And I said, Senator, I sort of pushed it across the table. I said, you might find this interesting. This is your grandfather's draft registration card for World War I. And he shed a tear. He just stared at it. There are no politics when it comes to remembering those who served 100 years ago or now.
This is the most unusual capital fundraising project I've ever been involved with.
And so I would mail letters to individuals who had relatives that fought. We had copies of their draft cards. It personalized it in a very poignant way to donors, and they responded to that.
So what we were able to do is get to some extremely patriotic, thoughtful private associations and business communities, and to weave in some support from the federal government, which we ought to recognize, to achieve our purpose.
That money comes from our taxes, and we should be saying, thank you, Americans, for supporting this. We built this and designed it for you, and we hope you appreciate it because you were behind it.
We launched an international design competition, and we had 350 submissions from all over the world.
People know the story of Maya Lin and the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, how she won that competition as an undergraduate architecture student at Yale University. One of the choices we had was to have an invited competition where we reached out to established designers, or we could throw it open and have an open design competition. And we went one step farther and said, you don't have to be a licensed architect. I had this vision of getting a sheet of 8 by 11 ruled notebook paper from Mrs. McGillicuddy's second grade class with a concept for a memorial that we would take seriously. And that's kind of what happened.
I came across the competition online one day. I was bored and it was just sort of a rainy Saturday. And I saw the competition, knew nothing about World War I. And I went to the commission's website and they had links to the National Archives and all these great repositories. And instantly I was hooked and kept clicking and clicking and clicking. And the thing that very quickly I realized was, most of these guys in these photos are 19 to 25 or so. They're incredibly young, and I was 25 at the time. And so I felt a real connection with them and wanted to be a part of telling that story in some way. And so I worked sort of nights and weekends on a design and sent it off and completely forgot about it, actually, until 2 months later. I got a series of missed phone calls and called this strange number back, and they said, are you sitting down? And they said, you're one of the 5 finalists. Can you fly to DC in 2 weeks? It was my first time ever to come to Washington, DC. I hadn't seen the park in person, hadn't seen any of the other memorials in person. It was all new to me. And the very first thing I noticed was these other teams walking in, everybody in their sort of Mad Men suits with their entourage. And me, it was just me. I'd gone out and bought a suit for the occasion, and I was trying to make a good impression on day one. And we went around the room and everybody introduced themselves. And it got to me.
And he said, I'm Joe Weishar, and I just feel really lucky to be here.
I just had a series of images photoshopped together and a concept. And so the commission sort of looked at that and they said, it looks like you've got a lot of sculpture here. How are you going to do that? I had no idea, So I did what any 25-year-old would do, and I Googled sculptors. And, the top lists are like Michelangelo and all these guys who have been Renaissance sculptors. So I said, okay, well, I need somebody American to do this piece, of course. So I Googled American sculptor, and all these guys came up, and they all had died in 1929 or earlier. And so, of course, I then refined the search to American sculptor living, and that gave me the top results of the National Sculpture Society's website. And so I just sat there with a legal pad for about 4 hours and wrote down names. Sabin, for some reason, was with the S's and not the H's for Howard. He had the right vision, the right set of skills. And I basically cold emailed him.
It was September 14th, and he said, opportunities like this rarely come up. I urge you to join in a partnership with me as a sculptor to create the sculptural aspect of the memorial. And I didn't write back. I just picked up the phone and called him and said, yes, Joe, I'm in. And he was, I think, rather shocked that I responded within 2 hours.
It wasn't until after I contacted Sabin that I found out that he had also entered the competition and had not made the short list.
There was something in my head that kept telling me the project's not over. So when I got the email from Joe, I knew I was supposed to go forward. And as soon as we went to the first Centennial Commission meeting, I knew that we were going to win.
When we started working together, he just had this great repository of things to start drawing from immediately. And we didn't have to sit there and pitch ideas back and forth of what does this look like.
We announced Joe Weishar and Sabin Howard as the winners of the design competition in January of 2016. Their design was unanimously chosen by our jury, and we announced it during a commission meeting, which is an open meeting to the public. Anybody can dial in and listen.
He and his wife Tracy were listening on the radio, and Sabin said, they're talking about a design and it sounds a lot like ours. I'd gone into work that day because, if I didn't get the project, I needed to have a job the next day. And all of a sudden I start getting another call. And so I said, hang on, Sabin, let me put you on hold for a second. I've got this other call. And it was the Chicago Tribune. She said, I just want to be the first person to congratulate you. And I said, congratulate me on what?
One of those great only in America stories. Here's Joe, he's an architectural student. When his design was chosen, he was probably the most surprised person in America.
So we had a great design, and now we needed to find a place to put it.
Every one of these projects in Washington are very controversial. What do you put on the mall? What do you put here? Do you do it at all?
There were a number of people who thought it needed to be on the National Mall. But the National Mall, in law, was a completed work of art. Congress suggested Pershing Park.
For years, I'd been to Pershing Park and admired it, but it turned into a trash-filled backwater right in the heart of D.C. One of the big challenges to anything in the Washington, D.C. arena is you have to get the approval of multiple bodies. So it is a challenging process. It's just unbelievable. It is a tricky business, and we should be mindful of the skill with which this effort was managed.
Through my preservation work, I had followed a lot of other memorial and other public design projects in Washington, so I knew the regulatory structure that we would have to go through. I knew about the National Historic Preservation Act. I knew about review by the Commission of Fine Arts, the National Capital Planning Commission. I knew that we could not simply come in and say, here's our design. There are points in the process where I now look back with hindsight and say, if I'd known we were going to have to do that, I'm not sure I would have taken this on.
18 different designs. And I don't know how many files I have saved on my computer that just say final, like final 1, like final 2. Because every time I did it, it felt like that should be it. You know, this is the best design that I've ever done. Everybody should recognize sort of how great this is. And then, of course, the next meeting would come up and there'd be some issue and, you know, somebody would say, go back and do it again. And, you know, that's sort of the worst feeling. And just pushing everything off to the side and saying, you know, forget what I've been working on the last 3 months or 4 months. Do it again.
We were very lucky that the architect we'd chosen was willing to work with us through the permit process. That was also a process on our part, realizing there was going to be give and take on both sides. We couldn't just steamroll this through. And they couldn't just steamroll over us.
You want to know what our democracy is all about and how it functions? It functions because people have the patience and the dedication and the determination to try to get something done in the face of every possible barrier you can imagine. But because there are those that have the determination to keep going, that's how we pass laws, that's how we make changes, that's how we solve problems, and ultimately, it's how you build memorials.
When we went to CFA, the Commission for Fine Arts, Dr. O'Connell presented our concept that we had modified after they made some recommendations. And they agreed that in principle, they would accept what we had submitted. When we left that room, it was like, hallelujah. This is going to happen. There will be a World War I memorial in Washington, D.C., in our nation's capital.
We didn't expect it to be a $40+ million project. We didn't anticipate the extent to which we were going to have to restore the site. Most importantly, we did not realize what a chance we were taking on Sabin Howard and how much we were going to ask him to extend his work. Sabin was someone who, when he came into the competition with Joe, we looked at his portfolio and said, clearly this is a gifted artist.
I was very lucky to be working with Edwin Fountain because we shared a similar vision of making a memorial that harkened back to the sculptures in front of the Capitol done by Schrady. What we were looking for was something that had the same emotional, impactful feeling of action.
If we had understood the magnitude of the leap from those individual, very formalistic figures to a 38-figure dynamic composition with a narrative woven through it, I don't know if we'd have the nerve to do it.
The soldier's journey comes from the idea of the hero's journey. And it depicts a soldier that begins at home, leaves home, enters into the battle, and from this battle is transformed to return home. And he's an allegory for the United States, as well as a mythological man who has a representation of what we all go through in life, where we begin a life, we are transformed by our life, and we return to our beginning.
As a veteran, I had experienced a number of those scenes in that soldier's journey. So I was really moved by just seeing the story. And it will be a timeless memorial as you approach that 7-foot tall, 58-foot long sculpture with 5 different scenes in it. If you have been a soldier, sailor, Marine, Coast Guard, or whatever, you're going to relate to at least 3 of those scenes.
I get very emotional when I talk about it. When you look at the statues, the soldier's journey, it's every soldier's journey, not just the doughboy. You leave home, you leave your family. If you're married and have children, you leave your children, as our doughboy does in the sculpture.
That's not just the story of the soldier. It's also the story of a nation. America didn't want to go to war. Wilson was elected on a campaign slogan of "He kept us out of war." And the following April, he declared war based on the things that were going on in the world that he simply could not ignore anymore.
I'm doing this interview today at the U.S. Customs House in Battery Park City. A little more than 100 years ago today, the troops left New York Harbor right outside my window to sail across the Atlantic to uncharted territory for most of them to fight in World War I. It was a global war that transformed the planet. I'm very proud to be a part of this. I'm honored.
You don't see things like this anymore. It tells a story in a very traditional narrative way that has been told by the ancient Persians. You see it in the friezes of the ancient Greeks on up to certainly the Civil War era. But today you don't see this type of large monumental sculpture telling a story on this level. I see the power that it has for people who see it, and it really helps talk about war to people who need to hear those words and understand it at a deeper level.
When you talk about diversity being strength, women came out of the home for the first time to be able to participate in the war. Frankly, we got the right to vote shortly thereafter as a result of their work. African Americans came out of the fields in many cases. Native Americans, in that point, then run off into reservations, came out and participated as soldiers, as doughboys in World War I. Immigrant Americans, they all came together, and the rest of the world was very grateful.
We remember World War II, Rosie the Riveter, fighting in the munitions factory. Rosie the Riveter had a mother, and that mother worked in the factory in World War I. With the men on the front, they needed more women to come into the factories. They're taking the oath of loyalty in uniform. The Navy had a whole class, and they were paid the same as men. There were thousands of women who enlisted in the Army Nursing Corps. You see a professionalization of that career. Highly skilled nurses developing new techniques for battlefront nursing. Some of them were the hello girls, the telephone operators that were working for the U.S. Signal Corps, and they really gave the best of their efforts to help with communications, which of course are key, all over France as well as in Britain.
What number, please? One moment, sir. I'm sorry that line is busy. I have a question about the placement of this monitor.
The Hello Girls is a new American musical about the first women who served as soldiers in the United States Army. They were bilingual French-English translators who operated telephones on the front lines of World War I. The Army put out a call for women, and they thought they might get 100 applications, and they received 7,000 applications. All of the audiences that we've shared this story with have just been amazed that this was a bit of history they'd never heard about. I feel like we've dropped a pebble in a pond, and the ripples that continue flowing out as we tell this little-known history have been really wonderful to experience.
The Hello Girls connected over 26 million calls during their service.
As America's first women soldiers, they paved the way for women's suffrage.
After the war was over, they continued their fight for recognition and equality for almost 60 years.
Until finally, in 1977, the Hello Girls were granted veteran status by the U.S. Congress.
Every choice we make, we're making, shaping and molding
The closing song of the Hello Girls is called Making History. And what we're trying to communicate through that song, Making History, is the idea that history isn't something that happens. History is the actions of people, the choices you make.
My grandfather's name was Thomas Davie. He was a sergeant in the American Expeditionary Forces. My grandfather went off to fight for an ideal. He didn't fight for what he was experiencing in his life. He couldn't vote. He couldn't sit on the front of the bus, but he was prepared to go off and fight for democracy and the ideals that built this country and that he invested in. He was prepared to give his life. And that, is, to me, is the definition of patriotism. I mean, you don't get any more profound definition of patriotism than somebody who will fight for an idea, even in spite of the realities of their current circumstance. And he and 300,000 other African Americans did just that. The African American soldiers came back from Europe at the end of the war in 1918. And they brought back a different sense of who they were, of self. They brought back a different sense of how the rest of the world operated, because many of them had never been outside of the United States and didn't know anything but slavery and Jim Crow. And so they were able to see that they didn't have to live like that, and there was a different way. When they did come back, there was a huge march in Harlem, which everybody wore white, to say that Black Lives Matter. And they came back prepared to talk about the realities that they had observed in Europe. And that had a ripple effect throughout the Black community. There are many people who say that it was their intervention or their experiences that planted the seeds for the civil rights movement that blossomed, 60 years later. They so believed in the ideals of democracy.
Indian people have served on a per capita basis more than any other group, starting with World War I. The Indian people that served in World War I were not considered citizens of the United States, yet they went and fought for the United States. When you're in the military, you have a camaraderie that you can only explain if you've been in the service. Those folks then went on to become senators and congressmen and helped push the recognition. So in 1924, Indians became citizens of the United States.
The National World War I Memorial really is an antidote to amnesia, being able to continually remind us about how important this war was and what an impact it had on the country. We had a fantastic design team, and I promised myself and them that I would not interfere in the design.
When Joe and Sabin and the team found out that they had won the competition and were going to do the project, I think the first reaction was, oh boy, now we really have to do this, right? Then it's a matter of rolling up your sleeves, figuring out which steps in the process are next, and starting to execute them. This wasn't just about creating a memorial. It was about also bringing back to life, revivifying an urban park. So creating a worthy World War I memorial in what needs to be a functioning urban park with the significant fabric and resources of the historic park really became the challenge.
You have the main figure of General Pershing, the general on the pedestal, and then on the opposite side of the park, you'll have Sabin's sculpture about soldiers and the common man journey that they go through in the war. And so we're marrying these two elements of the great man and the everyman. And then you have the Belvedere that really, tells that story and ties the two together and sets the two in context of each other. And then around it, you have this amazing landscape that really changes throughout the year. And so hopefully it really becomes this multi-seasonal thing that people have to visit different times of the year.
The NPS worked with us side by side to help us create a park that was workable. If sometimes a design idea would come up and they say, well, we tried that, didn't work. There were things that we don't think about every day. And they really helped with understanding the plantings, which we were very committed to having a beautifully landscaped park.
To have it in a park-like setting, I just think is good for the spirit. You're right there on Pennsylvania Avenue, for goodness sakes. And You know, that's the heart and soul of Washington, D.C.
We've had this huge team, the fountain technician, the stone carvers, all these people working together to pull this off.
No memorial has been built or has been completed in Washington, D.C. as fast as the National World War I Memorial was. That's really in large part due to the involvement of the client, the knowledge of the people involved, and the collaboration and effort that we put forth.
I am a veteran. I received a medical discharge when I was in service. This gives me the opportunity to fulfill, my duties for the country. If you follow the photos of the job, you can see where we started doing the demo. You can see elements being removed. And as we started putting things back together, you can see concrete being placed. You can see cobblestones being reinstalled. You can see the sculpture wall being built.
The pen metal text and lots of different bronzes.
Every project has surprises. The World War I Memorial had a couple.
We did some soil sampling early on and we found the soil to be terrible. We had to come up with a new pile system for how we would support the loads, as well as a new supportive excavation system.
We're trying to match some historic elements, and we were surprised that this stone really hasn't changed that much, which helps us match it very closely, especially in the quantities that we need.
It's a great feeling to know that this is something that is going to last forever.
Building the memorial wasn't just building the bricks and the mortar and the fountain and bringing the trees in. It's also about building the education foundation. And we wanted the park to be a place where people could come for reflection, for remembrance, for a nice place to have a sandwich, but also a place for people to learn.
I had lunch yesterday with one of our major donors, and she looked at me and she said, she said, I'm trying to remember if I ever learned about World War I in school. She said, I think I heard that an archduke was shot, and then it was World War I. And then we started to talk about World War II. This memorial is designed to be experiential in nature and to tell that story so that future generations can learn from the past.
The integration of technology at the World War Memorial is really important. We're providing some interpretive content, we're providing some of the story to the visitors of the park, but what we're really providing them is an opportunity to dig deeper, right? So if they find a little bit of information that leads them to find more information on the history of the war, that's really what we want to accomplish at the site.
We have a series of apps, one for a World War I guide to be used at the site, and another, a virtual World War I memorial that can be used anywhere on the planet to learn more about this.
One of the real strengths of the National Memorial in Washington, D.C. will be the multiplicity of ways in which people can access the story of the war. And so I think that the beauty of that is that it personalizes something which is sometimes hard to get your head around. This war was of such magnitude, but it brings it and distills it into the story of one person, of their sacrifice, of their family, of their comrades, of the arc that they went through in leaving, in serving, and returning.
I had one volunteer at one point. She was quite young and had been deployed to Iraq, and I said, tell me why you're interested in World War I. She said, I had friends who died in Iraq, and I had friends who came back and whose lives are forever changed by the experiences that they had in Iraq. I don't want them to be forgotten, and I don't think we should forget the doughboys. Every day at 5 o'clock, we play taps. And some of my colleagues said, you mean during the summer? I said, no. I mean, every day. In snowstorms and ice storms, every day, without fail, at 5 o'clock, we play taps.
For 60 seconds, everybody stops. And in a place like Washington, D.C., where everybody's always hustling and bustling around, it's remarkable.
For 60 seconds, a bugler has the most important job in the military. Because I'm a bugler at heart, I'm so proud of those musicians who stand out there in extreme heat, in the middle of winter. It means that our message continues on every single day. Taps that sounded every day is not only for those who've gone before, but it also is a salute to every man and woman who have served in uniform for our country, past, present, and future.
I'd actually seen a lot of fighting. I have no conception of the level of violence and misery that these World War I soldiers, the French, the Brits, and the Americans had to endure, particularly given cold weather, the massive amounts of artillery, the astonishing levels of casualties in which units routinely were almost obliterated.
I'm the daughter of a historian. He's a history professor. He was also a World War II vet. And I think part of his healing of the war process was bringing his whole family over to Europe when we were little, a few times. We visited the beaches of Normandy, but when we went to Verdun, our father got tears in his eyes. And it's very profound when you're a little girl and you've never seen your dad cry, to see him on a holiday being so upset. And my sisters and I all think of the battles of World War I as being particularly tragic, I think in part because we saw how moved our father was.
In the battlefield, seeds of poppies would lie in the ground dormant perhaps for as long as 80 years. And during these bombardments, the soil would be turned up and then often and tragically nourished by the nutrients of decaying bodies. These poppies then began to bloom. You might see that I'm wearing a poppy today, a symbol which was soon adopted in the days after the war as people sought to make meaning out of the war and find a way to memorialize and remember the lives of their loved ones, of people in their communities whose lives were lost or so profoundly impacted by the Great War.
It reminds me of my father, who, among thousands of other young men and a few women, joined up to go into World War I. Dad was a doctor, and he was a captain, decorated, injured. He didn't ever brag upon it, but he wanted me to know about it and the degree of suffering. Flanders Field, that's the poem, because he loved that. And he would read that on Memorial Day. In Flanders Field, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place. And in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly scarcely heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Field. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you, from falling hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us, who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies will grow in Flanders Field. He'd say, I hope you and your generation will do everything to avoid a repetition of what I saw and experienced. I'll remember those words are riveted in my mind because we didn't. And that's what I think this memorial may do.
It should have been built, the day after the war ended. I hope that people, take some time and learn that it was done 100 years after the fact, and they find out about the amazing people who made it happen.
When I first met Judge Poe, he said to me when he saw the drawings, "Where does the flagpole go?" And I looked at the drawings, and I didn't see it. So I went back to the design team and said, "Where's the flagpole go?" And they go, "Right here." When we raised the flag in first colors for the first time, it was really a testament to the enduring nature of those colors that flew for those doughboys 100 years ago and who flies today for our troops and for our country around the world.
The first color ceremony, there's really a lot of emotions that run through you when a project opens, and a project of this much significance. So there is pride, there is remembrance of those that have served and died. There is really sort of a hope for the future. My kids were able to join me at the opening, and it makes you realize the impact that the World War I Memorial will have on future generations, on everyone that comes to visit the site.
I thought of my father on First Colors Day, and I think it would have really a profound meaning for him to see the efforts of these men and women, that World War I generation, finally being recognized. He would be saddened by hearing the taps being played, because it would remind him of the deaths of people that he knew. But he would also be thankful that we were finally taking the time and the energy and the treasure to create something like this.
When I saw that flag going up the flagpole, I stood up and saluted, because it's a symbol not only of our country, it's frankly a symbol of the spirit that was involved in making this memorial a reality. That flag over that memorial is going to be a living symbol of why patriotism is at the heart of being a good citizen.
With the United States Air Force. It's a great honor to fly over this wonderful memorial with you and recognize the huge sacrifice made by the United States in World War I. Thank you.
I think that the World War I generation would be very pleased with the way the memorial turned out. Certainly the only memorial in Washington, D.C. that includes space for the contemplation of peace. And that war was truly a war with the forethought of we were going to have peace in the world after this. Instead, it crafted the peace to end all peace for the 20th century. So it's a very appropriate sighting of a fountain dedicated to peace to be part of a World War I memorial.
Admiral Mullen was standing with me in front of this fountain one day, and he looked at it and he was somewhat deep in reverie, and he said, "This is really important." And he looked at me and he said, "In my entire military career, I had the duty to speak to families who had lost loved ones as a result of war. And I say to them, is there anything I can do for you or your family? And they always say, remember them."
I think Sabin's nervous. I get to be the excited one. He's the one who has to watch his piece fly through the air. And I just get to hope and pray that it lands in the right spot.
Oh, it's an exciting day. It's the day that is the beginning of the end of the process of building a World War I memorial. We're installing the first portions of the sculpture of the soldier's journey, which is the focal point of the memorial.
I'll be honest, I'm a bit moved. Watching that first section of the sculpture get loaded onto the wall brought out a lot of emotion. It is very rewarding to get to this stage.
The project began with photography in the South Bronx, where 12,000 pictures were taken. From these pictures, I created 18 different iterations. I didn't shoot the photographs straight on. I lowered my eye level to about mid-knee. Shooting slightly below gave the figures a sense of monumentality and heroism. So I could create something through my drawings that was heroic, but here's the trick. It's also intimate at the same time, and it's about human beings. So it's accessible. We have to take that drawing and you have to put it into a three-dimensional format. So transferring that then to a sculpture took me to New Zealand. I did a 10-foot ball. And then going through the Commission of Fine Arts, which is a horrific experience for any artist. And then we move on to the next phase, which is the actual sculpting of the full-size piece. There is no book to locate. How do you do this? There's no sculpting memorials for dummies. This is like one of those things that, as an artist, you're creating, but now you're creating on a whole different level.
The foundry who cast the bronze is Pangolin Editions in the UK, and they've been absolutely flawless, start to finish.
We try and fit the processes of the foundry to the language that the artist uses. Sabin is a real classical artist, so things are going to be really important to him, like form, like texture, the fidelity to the expression that he spent so long capturing. That is what he needs from us.
I'm struck by the craftsmanship, the caring for every little detail that is produced by hundreds of artists. This is a really radical sculpture. But you look at the art world, nothing like this is being done today at all. The project is epic, just dismissing the fact that it took 9.5 years.
The work that we've put into this is a little thank you to the American people that they stepped in when we needed them. Anybody of my age will have lost either a grandparent or a great uncle in that war. It was so devastating to the British people, how many people died in it. And in Britain, we know that if the US hadn't stepped in at the time it did, that total would have gone up much higher. There's something very, very powerful in the sense that allies can work together to protect freedom, to protect democracy. That's a very powerful message and one we must never forget.
The young dead soldiers do not speak. Nevertheless, they are heard in the still houses. Who has not heard them? They say, whether our lives and our deaths were for peace and a new hope or for nothing, we cannot say. It is you who must say this. We leave you our deaths. Give them their meaning. We were young, they say. We have died. Remember us.
I was a believer. I knew it was going to happen. I knew that there's still a story to tell. There are still opportunities that can continue. There's still work to be done.
We need to make sure that the world understands why it's better to have governance by the people, for the people, and of the people, as opposed to some other way. That was what was at stake in World War I.
This memorial represents a fulfilled commitment to military men and women everywhere who right now are serving our country. It's a commitment to them to let them know that in 100 years their service will not be forgotten. It's a commitment to my great-grandfather who served in World War I 100 years ago. He's not forgotten.
Frank Buckles pursued it until we got it done. It's a tribute to America's finest, the American warrior.
The 18-year-old young Marines and soldiers and sailors and airmen who visit that park will be reminded of the incredible responsibility they have, not just to protect America, but to stand with our allies. That's a lesson of World War I and an argument for peace, not war.